I'm Paul Caiazzo. I'm a Senior Vice President of Security and Compliance at Avertium. So I handle our internal security, things like SOC 2 and PCI compliance. But I also spend quite a lot of time working with our most strategic customers around complex problems they're trying to solve. And a lot of the questions that I've gotten recently are, what is zero trust? What does it mean to me? How could I implement it within my organization, and what benefits might I derive from that? So excited to talk to you all about that today. I'm joined by a real expert with respect to zero trust, and that's Jason Garbus of Appgate. So Jason, thanks for joining today.
Thanks, Paul. I'm looking forward to this, and we're really excited about the partnership between Appgate and Avertium. I'm Jason Garbus. I'm Senior Vice President of Products at Appgate, and in this role, I'm responsible for working with our prospects and industry analysts and our customers, as well as setting the product direction and strategy. I spent a lot of time working on talking about zero trust and how to approach it. I also have a volunteer role outside of the organization where I work with the Cloud Security Alliance, where I'm co-chair of the Software-Defined Perimeter Zero Trust Working Group. So in that role, I again have the opportunity to work with folks across different organizations, researching and writing about zero trust and SDP.
Fantastic. I can't wait to talk to you about this today. So as I mentioned, one of the key things that I spend a lot of time doing is talking to customers about what problems they're trying to solve. And interestingly, and I think similarly to you, Jason, we deal with customers across a very wide variety of industries, but I hear a lot of the same problems regardless of what type of company it is or what industry they happen to find themselves within. Some of those problems are reflected with what's on the screen here today. And I think, if you think about zero trust as, really a philosophy, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later, it really does drill into the crux of a lot of these problems. And, thinking through a couple of these specifically, we won't go through every single one of them, but a lot of the problems in sort of the security landscape today really result around organizations having had architected effectively flat networks that don't really have a lot of segmentation built into the network, which allows for a single compromise, let's say a single malware infection, to really create a very broad problem for the organization because they have a very difficult time containing it. So we see a lot of issues with respect to that, and also with respect to just vulnerabilities that exist inside public-facing applications like VPNs. And I think we all know everybody's using VPNs right now, or a lot of people are. And so it's something that the attackers know as well. And we'll speak a little bit more about that as well. But I think one of the other key things on this slide that jumps out to me, again, comes up all the time with our customers, is really around that information governance pillar. Knowing what data you're using, what data you're consuming from your customers, where you've got PII or PHI, and how that actually reflects within your technology strategies. It's a challenging thing to solve for. And again, it sort of also ties back to that very flat network, creating a situation where a single incident can create a really significant data breach for an organization because they haven't thought through a lot of that information governance stuff. And zero trust really does, again, speak to the core of that. I think one of the other key things that I see a lot is just complexity. Companies today, they're no longer just having on-premises type of architectures in a data center someplace. Almost every customer we talk to has some cloud presence, usually across multiple different cloud providers. Whether they're an AWS customer and also an Office 365 customer, that's very, very common. And sort of managing identity and access across that complex environment is a pretty challenging thing for a lot of organizations to solve for, especially when they really start scaling up and they've got large physical presences or their entire staff is working from anywhere. I'd be curious for the audience if there are other challenges that you guys see. We'd love to hear from you guys. So drop that into the chat. But Jason, again, same question to you. Is this sort of resonating with the questions that you guys get, or the problems that you're trying to solve for?
Yeah, it really does, Paul. There's a very broad set of issues and challenges that organizations have. You've captured a lot of them on here. I'll just pick on a couple. So one of them is organizations, I think, are really hamstrung in some ways by traditional networking and the very design of TCP/IP, which is designed to be open and to advertise itself. And this is, a terrible way to do things given today's threat landscape, not only for internal networks where you have either malicious users or malware that gets easily introduced through phishing, or external entry points like VPNs. I mean, you would never design a system that advertises itself and makes itself available 24/7 to every adversary on the planet, knowing what you know. And zero trust, this approach helps organizations really avoid that fundamental openness and public nature of their networks to significantly improve their security posture. And I think the other one at the other side is you talk about scalability and complexity. And one of the most important aspects of Zero Trust is how the policy model that drives access is and needs to be dynamic and contextual, so that you can have an architecture and a platform that lets you define descriptive policies or declarative policies that then get rendered at runtime, at access time, looking at attributes of the user and the workload, and automatically make adjustments, so you don't have to have an army of people trying to catch up by making firewall configuration changes, for example.
Yeah, I agreed. And so that dynamic orchestration is something that I'm very interested in as well, especially as it applies to our managed services customers, where we detect a threat, we want to very quickly move into containment and eradication. And that sort of dynamic nature of Zero Trust, when implemented well, really does produce quite a lot of benefits for the customers that we work with. But we're hearing about this now much more than ever before, and so we thought to ourselves, so why do we think that is? Why is this such a significant thing right now? And I think a lot of it boils down to just really three key things. First off, the perimeter really doesn't exist anymore. It used to be a situation where, again, your infrastructure, sort of ended at your firewall, and everything behind the firewall was assumed to be trusted. Unfortunately now, that firewall almost is sort of inconsequential, or at least much less consequential to your security posture. And why? Because you've got users everywhere, right? So you have users in their home offices, or in a Starbucks. You've got data in a data center, or on one of those user devices, or in the cloud someplace. And so you've got all of these moving parts all around, and you can no longer look at it as just simply you've got a perimeter that needs to be protected. And really, again, Zero Trust very much focuses on that. One of the key things that we saw early in the pandemic as people were trying to move to the very rapid work from anywhere, was that secure connectivity for those remote workers was a complex thing to get implemented, and also very costly and cumbersome to get implemented quickly, either by increasing VPN licenses or all sorts of things like that. So that's another reason why we think this is coming up so much right now, because there are elegant ways to solve for that, the depth of the perimeter, which again, I think Zero Trust really speaks to very directly. I mentioned on that prior slide, but complexity within the cloud. Most organizations, again, have some mix of on-premise infrastructure, platform, software as a service, and identity and access management across all of that. It's tricky, right? So there's a lot of different point solutions like CASB, our Cloud Access Security Brokerage, that can solve for some of those problems, but they don't do anything to help for that secure connectivity to ensure that the correct users are accessing the correct resources regardless of where they exist. And so that's another reason why we see this coming up right now, because it's just going to get more and more complex. And the other thing is the bad guys know all that, right? So the bad guys understand that our users are working from anywhere. They understand that organizations struggle with information governance and have architected flat networks that really make detection and containment very difficult, and they're leveraging that. So they're using that to great effect. Ransomware as a service threat actors are continuously finding ways to break through that, the VPN vulnerabilities, for instance, and I'll speak about a case study a little bit later specifically about that. But those remote solutions, like a split tunnel VPN, for instance, which is what most organizations did, allows for a side channel for the threat actor to get in and then pivot into the corporate network, and then also to exit or exfiltrate data from the network, totally circumventing the security controls that the organization has built. So we think these are the key reasons why people are interested in Zero Trust now. And again, I'll ask the audience if there are other reasons why you came today to learn about it. What's driving you today, making it interesting and inspection worthy today? I'd love to hear about it. And Jason, again, same question to you. Do you think these are the issues which are driving people towards Zero Trust adoption?
They definitely are. I think that if you look at the explosion of distributed and varied set of cloud resources that are being utilized by organizations, whether they're SaaS or infrastructure and platform as a service, across different, not just locations, but of course different cloud environments or cloud service providers entirely, that magnifies the complexity, and it really makes it very difficult for security teams to have a unified model in terms of policy and enforcement across all these different things. And one of the nice things about Zero Trust as a set of principles and as a platform that organizations can choose to do that is it operates as a normalizing overlay on top of these networks, and it allows you to have a single policy model, a single set of mechanisms to enforce those policies across these very different and very heterogeneous environments. And that gives organizations the ability to have a much simpler type of operating model, despite the heterogeneity and the complexity and the ever-changing nature of the underlying infrastructure, and to tailor it to the individual users. Because there's definitely no more castle and moat from a traditional perimeter perspective. You've got workloads and resources and data all over the place, and you have individuals, identities accessing it from all over the place. And those identities can be people, or they can be services themselves. And that complexity is itself going to be an enemy for security, unless and until organizations take a zero trust approach with this homogenizing layer that simplifies it through this unified approach.
Sure, I agree, and I think it's interesting you mentioned sort of the normalization and simplicity. When done well, a simple solution is going to work better than something more complex. But I'm sure we've got audience members here today that are really new to zero trust and would like to just understand more about what it actually is. So I'd love for you, Jason, to explain to our audience what is zero trust.
So thanks, Paul. So zero trust is, I think, best summarized as a philosophy and approach and a set of principles toward approaching security. And it's really taken together a lot of really great ideas that people in the industry have had over the last 10, really even 15 years, and put them together in a way that is at least consumable and understandable. And there's been some great thought leadership out of the National Institute of Standards and Technology in the United States. They came out last fall with what they call the Zero Trust Architecture documents, special publication 800-207, and they talk about zero trust as this is a set of guiding principles for workflow, system design, and operations, and it's really built on some principles that are listed right there. And a lot of this built on things that have been used in the U.S. intelligence community for their secure networks for many years, the ideas that were promoted by this organization called the Jericho Forum probably 10, 15 years ago, and Forrester Research, who created the term, coined the term zero trust about 10 years ago as well. And ultimately, the three core principles are making sure that all resources are accessed securely regardless of location. And I've always interpreted that to mean all workloads and data are accessed securely regardless of where the user is or the entity that's accessing them, as well as where the resource is. So you have a many-to-many problem there. You also have to enforce the least privilege access, or the principle of least privilege, across the network and at the network layer. And this is where zero trust really fills in a gap that's traditionally been there between application or authentication level security and network level security. And in your VPN case study you'll talk about later, it's a perfect example of this, which is if you don't have an account or a reason to access an application, there should be no reason that you can even access it at network level, because it just exposes too many vulnerabilities. And then finally, the last principle is about inspecting and logging all traffic appropriately to make sure that the organization has really good visibility into this. And taking those and then interpreting them, has some amazing implications for organizations where now you've got a much more secure network. You've taken your users and they don't have access to anything on the network until they've been properly authenticated. And then they're only authorized to access the given set of resources based on policies that are applied to them, utilizing their device and their location and the overall context in the organization. Now, zero trust is not an architecture, it's this philosophy. And one of the things that we'll be talking about is this concept called the software-defined perimeter, which is an architecture and that we believe is the best and most effective way to accomplish this. And I know, Paul, you probably have some comments on zero trust as well.
Yeah, for me, I really think that the way I explain it is it's the ultimate manifestation of need to know and least privilege, and taken it and implemented and codified and enforced through technology. But if you think about, your users need to access certain data resources, but don't need to access many. And even when they do, they should have the least amount of privilege available to them. And really, zero trust is all about that. You've got to understand who the user is and what resources they need access to, and then very granularly grant that access to that user. And really, that's zero trust at its core to me. So I'm curious to know what does a day in the life of zero trust look like, Jason?
Sure. So let's talk through this, and we'll take our favorite employee, Sally, who is the director of finance for this organization. And you'll see as we go through this, the 3 bullet points in the upper right around helps us look at, is her access secure? Is the organization enforcing least privilege access? And how is this enriched logging happening? So Sally starts her day and she's working at home in the morning and she needs to access and check her email, of course. Now, because she's remote, the zero trust system says, hey, our policy is that if you're remote, you need to authenticate using multi-factor authentication. So she does that. Maybe she's using a biometric, maybe she's just entering a 6-digit passcode from an app, lots of flexibility there. She accesses the department server to get the latest presentation in addition to her email. but she really has very little network access. There's no reason for her to have broad access across the thousands of services that are running on that network. And now, unfortunately, Sally is human like all of us, and she clicks on a malicious link that was sent to her and actually installs malware on her device. And that's the end of our first step when Sally goes into the office. So Sally goes into the office for the afternoon, and she gets her laptop on the corporate network, and she can access the 3 departmental applications that she needs to be productive. She still has very limited network access, just like when she's remote. She can be fully productive, but there's no reason for her to be able to go to servers that are in the engineering department or the manufacturing department. She works in finance. Now, this malware recognizes that it's on a corporate network, and it starts to do a port scan. It starts to do some network reconnaissance. And the security system recognizes that. And that's one of the nice things about a zero trust system, is because her legitimate access is very, very tightly bound, anything that attempts to go outside that will be very easily noticed. So we'll get a significant reduction in the amount of noise on networks. The zero trust security system recognizes this and takes action by notifying IT, and also quarantines her device, really blocks it from the network, and also alerts Sally through a text message. Now, of course, Sally needs to be productive, and IT is on the case here. Now, Bob, who happens to be in another city, recognized that there's something to be fixed on Sally's device, because the workflow behind the scenes, their source system, has opened up a ticket in their service desk. IT, Bob, calls up Sally and says, hey, I need to fix your device because there's some malware on it. And he opens up a remote connection to remotely log in as administrator to her device. And what's interesting about that is that network connection is allowed only because there's a service desk ticket that's in the open state. So the zero trust system recognizes that it's tied to this business process and allows Bob to log in, perform the administrative activities to clean up the malware, only because there's a service desk ticket in the open state. So it's a really nice example of zero trust using, in this case, context from a business process to map down to enforcement at the network layer. And once Bob finishes his work, he closes the service desk ticket, that network connection goes away. So if Bob were malicious, or if Bob's device were somehow infected, he would no longer have access to Sally or the 5,000 other employees in this organization. So it's a really nice enforcement or example of the principle of least privilege.
Right. And I think, the audience, the CISOs, the IT engineers that are out in the audience today are probably looking at this and saying, boy, that sounds like utopia. And I have to say, from experience, achieving this level of orchestration and automation is not as challenging as you might think it is, provided you've got the right tooling and know your organization inside and out. And that's probably the biggest challenge that I see. We'll talk a little bit more about challenges a little bit later. But Jason, you talked about software-defined perimeter. I'd like to know a little bit more about that. Like, what are some of the key elements of it?
Sure thing. So I mentioned I'm one of the co-chairs of the SDP Zero Trust Working Group at the Cloud Security Alliance. And the CSA is a nonprofit industry consortium. All of the research and publications are freely available, and everyone on the call here is welcome to participate in any of the working groups. So there's no fee or membership required for that. The SDP architecture was created about 6 years ago. And what it does is it provides an architecture and approach that really captures and meets the principles of least privilege, while providing some nice specificity around how these components have to work. And the fundamental nature of SDP is that it's identity centric. So all entities or all subjects on the network need to be authenticated and validated. And what that does is, number one, it gives validation against an identity management system so that the SDP system can understand who they are and utilize identity context, such as group membership or attributes, to control what they have access to. It also gives the ability to look at device context or other types of contextual information, like what's the threat level on my internal network, to utilize all that information to then be able to make decisions. In the zero trust terms, this would be utilizing a policy decision point, or PDP, to decide what devices or what resources that given user should get access to. So go to the next build. It also, at a network layer, enforces and requires authentication before connection. And this is really a nice thing that SDP does to utilize some very basic cryptography to ensure that only authenticated and authorized users are allowed to actually establish a network connection. It really avoids some of the problems that organizations have today with things like VPNs or other remote access solutions that are exposed and advertising themselves to every adversary on the planet. Once a device has been authorized to connect, then there's a process of authenticating the identity, evaluating the policies, and then dynamically provisioning what we call one-to-one connectivity. So each user gets a different set of essentially logical network connections on the network based on who they are and on the contextual information that the policy engine evaluates. Everything else in the network is invisible. And then if we look at the last step, what SDP does is it provides a neutral way that works equally well across very different types of environments. So regardless of where the user is, then regardless of where or the technology that the resource that they're accessing lives, can be an infrastructure as a service or a platform as a service environment, could be traditional hardware in a data center, could be virtualized services running in a co-location. It provides a uniform and a unified way of controlling access. And if you remember, that again was one of the principles of Zero Trust.
Yeah, you know what I love most about Perimeter is how well aligned it is with what most organizations have done around software-defined networking, or SD-WAN. Very, very tight alignment there, and it doesn't require the rip and replace of technology that I think a lot of people have the misconception that Zero Trust actually does. So this is something that would overlay on top of an existing physical network infrastructure, and really, again, like we talked, apply the principles of Zero Trust through that dynamic and adaptive model, which really helps it tailor directly to the challenges that that organization is specifically trying to solve. So that's why I like Zero Trust. I think the other thing about software-defined perimeter and just Zero Trust in general is that it impacts really all elements of an organization's security program. And when I think about security programs, I try to balance that against the NIST cybersecurity framework. And for audience members that aren't working in the government or for a government contractor, you might be thinking, NIST, does that apply to me? The thing is, it actually does, because it's very extensible to basically every other regulation or framework that's out there. So if you're thinking about HIPAA compliance, for instance, or PCI, a lot of the core tenets of the NIST CSF will apply directly to it. And that's because it breaks it down into the 5 key areas of a security program. And those are identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And the key thing, again, is that Zero Trust, when applied well, will impact every layer of this. And I'll talk a little bit about what some of those impacts actually look like. I'm not going to go through every single one of these, but please do know that when done right, there are benefits across the spectrum for each of these key areas. But if you think about identify, for instance, one of the things that you're going to need to do to implement a Zero Trust strategy is to classify your data. And that's something that probably everybody in the audience that's had a security background has been hammering in the boardroom, that we need to know what data we've got. We need to understand how users access the data. But by doing that, you gain such a really amazing amount of knowledge about how your organization works. It just makes it that much easier to protect it. You can't secure that which you don't know about. And so identify really speaks to that point as well. From a protection standpoint, so now we understand what data we've got and we understand how our users need to access it. We can drastically reduce our risk surface by only presenting that sort of allowed data to the correct people. And so it's all about that need to know and least privilege again. It also gives us the ability to dynamically, as we were talking through some of those orchestration steps Jason spoke about earlier, dynamically respond to threats that we see on the network through vulnerability scanning, for instance, or through the detection of anomalous behavior. Jason mentioned it on the prior slide, but it's so true. When you've explicitly allowed traffic, and it's only explicitly allowed traffic is possible on the network, then anything that tries to do something other than that is going to be anomalous and worthy of inspection. And it gives you just a much finer grained sieve to filter out all of the noise that your security tools typically will generate for you, which then gives you a much more rapid response capability built into the technology. It can be either completely orchestrated or automated to the greatest extent possible. And really, it's about drawing down that window of opportunity for the bad guy. Should they gain access that Sally's machine gets the malware on it, that malware can't do much before you're able to actually respond to that threat, and then ultimately reprovision devices that have been impacted, again, hopefully through a lot of orchestration and automation. And again, if done right, a Zero Trust approach that's backed by software-defined perimeter really does impact every single one of these. So I'd be curious, Jason, if you had any additional thoughts on this slide, or if you've seen any other impacts that we didn't talk about here.
What's interesting about this slide is that it definitely can be overwhelming. I think we don't want folks to come away with the thought of, well, geez, I have to be perfect and have a high level of maturity across all of these areas and across all my functions before I can even start on zero trust. I think really the opposite is true. Even if organizations are relatively immature and they don't know where all the data is and they don't have great visibility, and they don't even maybe have a very baseline identity management program, there's still some terrific value that organizations can get from a zero trust approach pretty quickly. Even if it's something as simple as, I just want to replace my VPN. Everyone gets very broad network access. I'm going to give them the same broad network access because I don't know what people need. But if I put a zero trust solution in place, number one, I'm hiding the entry point from the attackers. Number two, I'm getting the ability to have some contextual information and make some dynamic decisions about who should access it or what level of authentication is there. And then organizations can build on that and start to say, all right, at least I know who are employees and who aren't employees. I know people who are in what physical office or what group they're in, and they can start to build on that and apply finer grained access control policies. And that's just in the identify column. And across the other areas, it's very straightforward for organizations to just start with what may be a low level of maturity and build on it. Zero trust really gives you the tools to do that easily and simply.
Yeah, agreed. And I know we have some use cases, and we want to get to question and answer. So let's talk through some of the challenges of implementing zero trust. And I'd love it if you could provide some insight here.
Sure thing. So zero trust can be complicated, and it especially can be complicated when it's looked at as this very large and long-term program. And if you read some of the literature around this, in particular, you look at how Google approached this in BeyondCorp in their series of white papers. They took a multi-year approach and developed a very comprehensive and very effective zero trust program for them. And I think organizations that are smaller, less sophisticated than Google, which is most of us, right, can sometimes be overwhelmed. So I think organizations need to take a step back and say, okay, I don't need to be perfect or have complete visibility into everything. Even if my IAM systems and processes are relatively immature, even if I'm not thrilled with the way my directory is, at least there's some basic information in there that I can rely on, and I can authenticate my users. I've got some basic group information, and the business processes around putting people into groups and disabling them when they leave the company are at least sound. So that's a pretty good foundation to build on. And don't let, especially for identity management, the perfect be the enemy of the good or the enemy of getting started. Really the same thing with the second bullet point there, which is you don't have to know to a high degree of granularity exactly what every resource or every user is accessing on the network. There's a tremendous benefit that you can get by just putting in place group-focused and even relatively coarse-grained access policies, because you're now validating user devices, for example, or because you're doing things dynamically based on group membership. There's a lot that organizations can do to build on even a modest level of visibility. I think that some organizations also look at zero trust and say, hey, this is great, I want to jump in with both feet and start off with a very big strategic initiative. And I think that that's great. We love customers and organizations that do that. I would still encourage folks to find a more focused initial project that you can do in 2 to 3 months, get some experience, learn about your platform and your architecture, and get some momentum in the organization. I think the risk is around zero trust can be that organizations will take a really long time to build out a very strategic program without delivering value to the organization initially. That's sometimes a challenge there. And then finally, zero trust requires changes to networks and to processes and changes to applications, or at least to processes around that. And there can sometimes be political or organizational pushback on those. So our recommendation is for security folks to start the conversations early, build relationships with your peers and people who own the networks and the applications, and get them excited about the benefits that zero trust can provide, and they'll be much more amenable to some of the changes that would be required.
Yeah, I agree with all that. And I think the key thing that we've guided customers to do is look for some initial use case. Generally, it's going to be a VPN replacement. Get that under your belt, do it well, and you'll learn a heck of a lot in the process, which then you can apply to some of those other maybe more complex use cases. Don't eat the whole elephant is, I think, the key guidance there. So let's just quickly, Jason, go through a couple of case studies here. Let's start with yours, where we look at sort of before software-defined perimeter and after.
Okay. So very quickly, this is an organization that is very DevOps focused, very high velocity, and very cloud centric. And they provide a bunch of cloud services, and they are pretty distributed as well. They have 3 main locations with about 800 plus users across the world, really. And they were really struggling using traditional VPNs as remote access methods into those cloud environments, because number one, they had many different accounts, over 25 accounts across all these different cloud environments, not to mention geographic distribution. And traditional VPNs, which imposed a single secure connection, really introduced a great deal of friction in the workloads. And the developers, of course, hated it, having to sign out of one VPN account and sign into another in the middle of trying to do some technical task. So that really was a big problem from a user experience perspective. It also made the configuration and operation of their cloud firewalls complicated as well, because they tried to manage the access controls on a per user basis, which is really very difficult. And the VPN solution also didn't give them the level of device validation that they wanted and needed in their environment. So they looked at the Zero Trust solution. They looked at the AppGate product, AppGate SDP, and they deployed that. And if we look at the after picture, what they did was they utilized the capability of the SDP architecture to have multiple concurrent secure connections from a user device to all of these SDP gateways that are running across this distributed environment. So there was no more signing in and signing out of VPNs. They turned on their device, the AppGate SDP solution automatically connected for them in the background, and they were just productive. This also simplified the cloud firewalls that were in place, because the firewall simply had essentially one rule, which was, hey, allow any traffic through as long as it's coming from the SDP gateway. And the actual dynamic policy enforcement was done by the gateway based on attributes of the user, but also attributes of the workload. So they utilized some of those metadata tags in those cloud environments to control which group or which team or which users had access to a workload. And they actually tied that into their whole DevOps tool chain. It was ended up being a very beneficial type of usage, because it actually accelerated and leveraged the DevOps workflows that they had. And then finally, they were able to tie the policies to the device context, utilizing their device management system, which in this case was Jamf.
Yeah, and I think that's really the key thing for me here is that just the immense improvement in simplicity is just a huge benefit to the organization operationally. I know this is your case study, but we see this same sort of thing playing out with customers that have heavy dev environments, because like I mentioned earlier, there's just so much cloud complexity. People have, especially if you're a developing organization, you have workloads in different places, generally, for some specific integration purposes and things like that. And you need to be able to balance all of these things we've talked about while doing it securely and with the correct identity. So I wanted to talk a little bit about an incident response situation that we got called into, and how a zero trust strategy would have actually simplified or actually negated the problem from happening in the first place, and also how the attackers originally effectively broke in. So this was a really serious ransomware attack. It was perpetrated by the NetWalker ransomware as a service group. And we were asked to come in and perform a root cause analysis, and discovered through that a publicly facing VPN server was exploitable, and it had been patchable for over a year, but the organization failed to keep up with patching, and unfortunately that's just all too common. But what happened was that exploit allowed the attackers to scrape every single credential used to access that network. And if you think about, everybody's working from home right now, so all of the knowledge workers were using that VPN. So basically every credential got compromised. And then ultimately the bad guys were able to leverage legitimate credentials to jump into the network and propagate malware throughout the network using like group policy objects and PowerShell scripts and things like that, which they never would have been able to do if some of the key tenets of the zero trust philosophy that we've talked about earlier were actually implemented in this organization. So we were asked to help them re-architect their network with that zero trust philosophy in mind. And then we started again with that remote worker use case, and then focused on expanding out from there to business applications and things along those lines. We also now perform the 24/7 monitoring for this organization, and so I can tell you with certainty that they've had similar attacks since. but none of them have been successful because, first off, we fixed the vulnerabilities, but secondly, our ability to help that organization contain individual malware outbreaks is just greatly improved over the course of this project. So I know we're just about out of time, but I do want to thank everybody for joining. Jason, again, thank you for bringing the insight that you bring to the table every time that we talk. I thought this was a great informational session for those who are not familiar with Zero Trust, and I'd love to get some questions from the group at large.